to a full-scale federal crackdown involving investigations, indictments, and convictions piling up faster than anyone expected. Federal agents from the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, working alongside state fraud units, began conducting site visits and executing search warrants across the Minneapolis Street Pole area. What they found should absolutely shock you. They uncovered schemes using shell nonprofits, fake companies, falsified meal count sheets, and phantom clients to steal hundreds of millions of dollars from federally funded state programs, including the Child Nutrition Program and Medicaid Housing Stabilization Services. This systematic theft was happening in plain sight, woven into the fabric of state-funded programs that were supposed to be helping people. Now, why does this matter to you? Because these weren't just bureaucratic slip-ups or minor paperwork errors. These were organized, deliberate efforts to steal public money. Money that could have gone to real seniors struggling with housing costs, money that could have fed actual children in need, money that could have supported health care for people with disabilities. Instead, it lined the pockets of fraudsters who saw government programs as easy targets. And here's where it gets even more troubling. As these investigations began to heat up and names started being named, one familiar political figure kept appearing in the background, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Now, I want you to hear me clearly. We have to be careful with language here. In our modern world, simply discussing connections can get you accused of all sorts of things. So let's just say that she is allegedly tied to some of these organizations, and individuals are raising serious questions, and those questions deserve answers. Let me paint a picture for you. Think about your own community. Think about the local organizations that help people, the food banks, the housing assistance programs, the nonprofits that step in when families hit hard times. Now imagine if those organizations, instead of helping, were fronts for stealing millions of dollars. Imagine if the people running them were faking records, inventing clients, and pocketing the cash while real families went hungry. That's what happened in Minnesota, and the scale is almost beyond belief. One of the programs at the center of this storm was called Feeding Our Future. On paper, it sounded wonderful. A nonprofit designed to provide meals to children and families, especially during the pandemic when so many people were struggling. The program received federal funding, routed through the state, with the promise that every dollar would go toward feeding kids who otherwise might go hungry. But federal prosecutors now say that somewhere between $200 and $300 million of that money was stolen through fake invoices, shell restaurants, and phantom meal programs. Let me say that again, because it's important. Between $200 and $300 million stolen from a program meant to feed children. How does something like that even happen? Well, investigators found that many of these so-called feeding sites didn't exist. People were billing the government for tens of thousands of meals a day that were never prepared, never delivered, never eaten. They set up fake companies, rented empty storefronts, and created paperwork that looked legitimate on the surface. And for a while, it worked. Money poured in, month after month, while children who actually needed help were left with nothing. And here's where Ilhan Omar's name enters the picture. There's video footage publicly available showing her at an event for one of these organizations. She's serving food, praising the work being done, talking about how important these programs are for her community, and the man she's standing next to, his name is Salim Saeed, and he later became one of the central figures in the Feeding Our Future fraud case. His restaurant was used as a front for billing the government for meals that never happened. He admitted to making over $1 million in profit from a $75,000 investment. And there she is, right beside him, celebrating the program. Now, does that mean she knew what was happening? Not necessarily. Does it mean she was involved in the fraud? We can't say that. But what it does mean is this: the people she publicly supported, the organizations she vouched for, the programs she defended, they were stealing from you, from me, from every taxpayer in America. And when the Minnesota Department of Education, overseen by Governor Walz's administration, started cutting off funding and demanding accountability in late 2020 and early 2021, she was one of the loudest voices pushing back. The MDE grew suspicious of the explosive growth in funding, but when they tried to stop payments, Feeding Our Future sued the state. Omar went on television, held press conferences, and talked about how cutting funding to meal programs was cruel, how it would hurt refugees and vulnerable communities. The MDE was ultimately compelled by a state judge to resume payments while the fraud investigation continued. But what she didn't talk about was the fraud. She didn't talk about the hundreds of millions of dollars being stolen. She didn't talk about the fake organizations, the sham marriages, the forged documents. Instead, she positioned herself as a defender of the vulnerable, even as the very programs she defended were collapsing under the weight of corruption. And it wasn't just feeding our future. As investigators kept digging, more programs started falling apart. There was a network of autism treatment centers, organizations that claimed to be providing therapy and support for children and adults with autism. Federal prosecutors now say that at least $20 million was fraudulently billed through these centers. Again, we're talking about fake clients, falsified records, and money disappearing into private accounts. Then there was the Housing Stabilization Program. This one is particularly painful because it was designed to help some of the most vulnerable people in society: seniors, people with disabilities, individuals struggling with addiction or mental illness. The program was supposed to provide support to help these people find and maintain stable housing. It was funded through Medicaid, and when it launched, the estimated cost was under $3 million a year. Within just a couple of years, online sources state that the number exploded to over $100 million annually. Why? Because the program had almost no safeguards. The barriers to entry were so low that almost anyone could sign up, create a company, and start billing the government. And that's exactly what happened. Hundreds of shell companies popped up, operating out of rundown office buildings and dilapidated storefronts. They claimed to be providing housing services to thousands of clients across Minnesota, but when investigators showed up to check, they found nothing. Empty offices, fake addresses, no clients, no services, just paperwork and bank accounts filling up with taxpayer money. So far, 8 individuals have been charged in connection with the housing fraud, and prosecutors say that's just the beginning. These 8 people alone are accused of stealing close to $10 million. And remember, that's just the first wave. Federal investigators are clear. This is the tip of the iceberg. They expect the total fraud in Minnesota's housing program alone to climb much higher as more cases come to light. Now, here's the question that should be on everyone's mind. How did this go undetected for so long? How did hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually totaling over $1 billion, disappear without anyone noticing? And more importantly, who was supposed to be watching? That brings us to Governor Tim Walz. For those who don't know, Tim Walz is the man who ran Minnesota during all of this. He was the governor when Feeding Our Future was stealing hundreds of millions. He was the governor when the housing program exploded from a few million to over 100 million in fraudulent billing. He was the governor when fake autism clinics were draining Medicaid funds. In fact, critics say his administration made it easier by designing programs with virtually no oversight, no verification, and no accountability. When federal investigators finally stepped in and started making arrests, they were stunned by what they found. One prosecutor, a man named Joe Thompson, who's been working fraud cases for years, said publicly that the depth of fraud in Minnesota took his breath away. He said it felt never-ending, like every time they turned over a rock, they found another scheme, another network, another set of criminals stealing public money. And here's what makes this even more frustrating. Tim Walz had bigger ambitions. He wasn't content just being governor of Minnesota. He wanted to be vice president of the United States. He ran alongside a doomed campaign, trying to position himself as a competent, compassionate leader who cared about working families and vulnerable communities. But back home, his state was falling apart. Programs were being looted, oversight was non-existent, and when the federal government started demanding answers, he was nowhere to be found. So let me ask you this. If someone can't manage their own state, if they can't prevent $1 billion in fraud from happening right under their nose, why on earth would we trust them with even more power at the national level? It's a question worth thinking about. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, fraud happens everywhere. There are always going to be bad actors. And you're right. But this isn't about 1 or 2 bad actors. This is about systemic failure. This is about a state government that either didn't care or didn't have the competence to protect taxpayer money. And it's about political leaders who, when confronted with the evidence, chose to deflect, to play the victim, to blame everyone else instead of taking responsibility. Let me give you an example. When the Trump administration, through its Department of Government Efficiency, started shutting down funding pipelines and demanding audits, Ilhan Omar held a press conference. She stood in front of cameras and talked about how these cuts were going to hurt refugees, how they were going to take food out of the mouths of children, how they represented the worst of America. She positioned herself as the compassionate one, the defender of the downtrodden, standing up against a cruel administration. But here's what she didn't say. She didn't say that the organizations she was defending were under federal investigation. She didn't say that hundreds of millions of dollars had been stolen. She didn't say that the very programs she was crying about were being used as vehicles for fraud. Instead, she made it about politics, about partisanship, about attacking the Trump administration, rather than addressing the real problem. And that, my friends, is how corruption thrives. It thrives when leaders deflect instead of lead. It thrives when media outlets ignore the story because it doesn't fit their narrative. It thrives when the people who are supposed to be watchdogs become part of the problem. So what do we do about it? How do we, as citizens, as taxpayers, as people who still believe in accountability, respond to something like this? Well, the first step is simple. We pay attention. We don't let the story disappear. We don't let it get buried under the next news cycle. We talk about it. We share it. We make sure people know what happened in Minnesota, because if it happened there, it can happen anywhere. The second step is we demand better. We demand that our leaders, regardless of party, take responsibility. We demand that programs designed to help people actually help people, not line the pockets of criminals. We demand transparency, oversight, and consequences for those who abuse the public trust. And the third step, and this is maybe the most important we remember who was in charge when this happened. We remember who defended the fraudsters. We remember who looked the other way. And when the time comes to vote, to support candidates, to hold people accountable, we don't forget. Because here's the truth. Government programs aren't inherently bad. Helping people in need isn't wrong. But when those programs become easy targets for theft, when billions of dollars disappear into the pockets of con artists, while real people suffer, something is deeply broken. And it's up to us, you and me, to demand that it gets fixed. Now, I want to take you deeper into the mechanics of how this fraud actually worked, because understanding the how is just as important as understanding the who. We're going to look at the fake marriages, the shell companies, the visa fraud, and the political connections that allowed all of this to continue for years. We're going to meet some of the people involved, see how they operated, and understand why Minnesota became such a hotspot for this kind of corruption. But before we do that, I want you to think about something. Think about the seniors in your community who rely on Medicaid. Think about the families who depend on food assistance. Think about the kids who count on school meal programs. Now imagine if the money meant for them was stolen. Imagine if the people in charge did nothing to stop it. How would that make you feel? Angry, betrayed, helpless. That's exactly how people in Minnesota are feeling right now. And that's why this matters. Because it's not just about numbers on a page or headlines in the news. It's about real people, real communities, and real consequences. So as we move forward, I want you to keep that in mind. This isn't abstract. This isn't political theater. This is about accountability, integrity, and whether or not we're going to accept a system where the powerful protect each other while the rest of us pay the price. The investigations are far from over. Federal prosecutors say they've only scratched the surface. There are more indictments coming, more arrests, more revelations. And as each new piece of the puzzle falls into place, the picture becomes clearer. Minnesota wasn't just a state with a fraud problem. It was a state where fraud was allowed to flourish because the people in charge either didn't care or didn't want to see it. And here's what makes it even more troubling. When you start looking at the details, when you see the actual mechanics of how this fraud operated, you realize it wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't some Ocean's 11 master plan. It was simple, brazen theft that happened because nobody was checking, nobody was asking questions, nobody was doing their job, Let me take you inside one of these operations. Picture a rundown office building on the edge of street pole. Peeling paint, cracked windows, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second thought. Inside, there are dozens of small offices, each one occupied by what looks like a healthcare company or social services provider. Signs on the doors, names that sound official, but when investigators walked through that building, they found something else entirely. A fraud factory. Office after office filled with people whose only job was to generate fake paperwork, build the government, and funnel money out the door. One building, just one, housed multiple fraudulent operations. Fake autism clinics, fake housing stabilization companies, fake meal programs, all under one roof, all stealing taxpayer money. And this wasn't an isolated case. Investigators found similar setups across Minneapolis and Street Pole. It was like an ecosystem of corruption, where everyone knew what everyone else was doing, and nobody thought they'd ever get caught. But here's what I want you to understand, because this is where it becomes more than just a crime drama. Behind every one of these fake companies, behind every fraudulent billing, there were real people who were supposed to be helped. That's the human cost of this scandal. It's not just about numbers or statistics or political talking points. It's about trust. It's about the social contract we have with our government. We pay our taxes, we follow the rules, and in return, we expect that our money will be used responsibly to help people who need it. When that contract is broken, when leaders look the other way, while criminals loot public programs, it doesn't just hurt the immediate victims. It hurts all of us. It erodes trust in institutions. It makes people cynical. It makes them wonder if anyone in power actually cares. And that cynicism is dangerous, because when people stop believing that the system can work, when they stop believing that accountability is possible, they disengage. They stop voting. They stop participating. They stop caring. And that's exactly what corrupt leaders want. They want you to feel helpless. They want you to think that nothing will ever change, so why bother? But here's the thing. Change is possible. Accountability is possible. And the proof is happening right now in Minnesota. After years of inaction, after years of fraud running unchecked, federal investigators finally stepped in and started making things right. They've conducted over 1,000 site visits. They've reviewed thousands of cases. They've arrested dozens of people, and they're not done, not even close. The lead prosecutor on these cases, a career fraud investigator, has been clear. They're just getting started. Every week brings new indictments, new arrests, new revelations. The Feeding Our Future case alone has resulted in 70 people charged so far, with a growing number of convictions from guilty pleas and trials already secured. The housing fraud cases are just beginning, with the first wave of 8 defendants representing only a fraction of what's to come. The autism clinic investigations are expanding, and investigators say they're now looking at other programs, other networks, other schemes that haven't even been made public yet. So the question becomes, why now? Why, after years of this fraud operating in plain sight, did things suddenly change? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It changed because the Trump administration decided to actually look, they decided to audit, they decided to send people into the field to verify that taxpayer money was being used appropriately. And when they did, they found a level of corruption that shocked even seasoned investigators. Now, you might be wondering, what about the state? What about Governor Walz and his administration? Shouldn't they have caught this? Absolutely. That's exactly their job. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They didn't want to catch it. Or at least, they didn't want to look too hard. Why? Because many of these fraudulent organizations were tied to communities and constituencies that supported them politically. Because investigating fraud in programs that serve immigrant communities or low-income neighborhoods might look bad politically, because it's easier to just keep the money flowing and hope nobody notices. But people did notice. Whistleblowers came forward. Community members started asking questions. Local reporters started digging. And eventually, the federal government stepped in and did what the state should have done years ago. And that brings us to the political fallout. Because when something this big explodes, when over $1 billion in fraud is uncovered in a single state, People want answers. They want to know who knew what, when they knew it, and why they didn't do anything about it. Ilhan Omar's response has been, to put it mildly, defensive. Instead of acknowledging the fraud, instead of calling for accountability, she's positioned herself as a victim. She's claimed that the investigations are politically motivated, that they're targeting her community unfairly, that the Trump administration is using this as an excuse to attack immigrants and refugees. But here's what she hasn't done. She hasn't condemned the fraud. She hasn't apologized to the taxpayers whose money was stolen. She hasn't called for reforms to prevent this from happening again. Instead, she's made it about herself, about her narrative, about her political survival. Tim Walz has been even quieter. As governor, as the person ultimately responsible for overseeing these programs, he should be leading the charge for accountability. He should be demanding reforms, firing incompetent bureaucrats, working with federal investigators to root out corruption. But he's been largely silent. And when he has commented on the fraud, it's been to deflect, to talk about how the state has limited resources, how these are complex problems, how they're committed to doing better. But commitment without action is just words. Now, here's where this all gets even bigger, because Minnesota isn't alone. This pattern of fraud in government programs, this culture of looking the other way when politically connected organizations are involved, it's happening all over the country. In California, whistleblowers have come forward saying that homelessness programs have become vehicles for money laundering, with billions of dollars disappearing into consulting fees and administrative costs, while the number of homeless people keeps growing. In Chicago, the city faces a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit, yet somehow teachers' union pension funds keep getting massive infusions, while third graders can't read at grade level. In New York, investigations into pandemic relief funds have uncovered similar patterns of fraud and abuse. What we're seeing in Minnesota is a symptom of a much larger problem. We've built a government system where money flows based on political connections, rather than actual need or effectiveness. We've created programs with no meaningful oversight, no accountability, and no consequences for failure. Imagine waking up to headlines that your tax dollars, money meant to feed children, house seniors, and support families were stolen. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times across one state. And now, the very people who promised accountability are the ones under fire. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the billion-dollar fraud wave, shaking Minnesota, the same state led by Tim Walz and represented by Ilhan Omar. What's emerging is a stunning web of shell nonprofits, fake aid programs, and political silence that reaches far beyond one city. Let's unpack how this all started, why the media prefers to stay quiet, and what it means when the watchdogs of power become part of the story. We're going to walk through something that should concern every American, but especially those of us who've been around long enough to remember when public service meant something. We're talking about Minnesota, a state that over the past few years has become ground zero for what federal investigators are now calling one of the largest public fraud operations in modern American history. We're talking about possibly over $1 billion in stolen funds. Programs designed to help the most vulnerable were turned into cash machines for criminals. And two names keep surfacing in the background of this unfolding disaster: Governor Tim Walz and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Now, I want to be clear from the start, this isn't about picking political sides. This is about understanding how systems break down, how power can shield wrongdoing, and why you and I, as taxpayers and citizens, have every right to demand answers. So let's dive deep together and see what's really been happening in Minnesota. For months, maybe even years, everyday Americans were asking the same question: when will someone be held accountable?